The transport sector is undergoing rapid change. What do you want the year 2050 to look like? What do you need from the transport of tomorrow? In an uncertain and volatile world, we must reimagine a better future. One in which transport across Asia and the Pacific works for both people and the planet. Right now, there are 10 trends shaping the future of transport. As the population continues to grow and our lives become more digital, we need a transport system that can keep up with the pace of change. Will our future transport support changing behavioral patterns? Climate change is causing more extreme weather, and the natural world needs to be restored. How can future transport be more resilient while working in greater harmony with nature? Asia and the Pacific's economy is the fastest growing in the world. Will our transport infrastructure meet the demands of evolving trade patterns and support sharing, circular, and green economies? We have imagined 8 visions for a better future for transport. In our vision of the future, transport will be reliable and efficient. Everyone will feel safe as they travel smoothly on their journey. 2050 is a world where all people from every community can enjoy affordable, accessible, and inclusive transport. As climate change causes more extreme weather, future transport will be flexible, resilient, and able to adapt to the challenges of our changing climate. In 2050, neighborhoods, cities, and regions will be better connected and integrated. It will be easier for us to get to where we need to go and for goods to reach their destination. We see a future where transport can help to restore and regenerate our natural ecosystems. Every outcome will consider nature and how both people and planet can thrive. Tomorrow's transport will be underpinned by champions and leaders who can plan, deliver, monitor, and manage transport in the long term. In the future, transport and technology are fully integrated, delivering seamless experiences for all. Technology will play a vital role in maximizing connectivity and encouraging sustainable transport choices. 2050 finds cities and countries connected through shared and co-developed transport systems. Collaboration towards global goals will unify transport throughout the region. By understanding the trends shaping the transport sector and visualizing a desired future, you can begin to explore what the year 2050 may look like in your context. Our report and playbook can help you on this journey. To prepare for what lies ahead, we must reimagine the future of transport and plan for tomorrow's challenges. Together, we can turn our shared visions for a better world into reality.
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Pamela Chang from the Transport Sector Group in the ADB. Together with Arup today, we are delighted to co-host a live webinar to launch our joint study on reimagining the future of transport in Asia and the Pacific. We have quite an exciting lineup of speakers today. There are 3 parts to the program, as we have presented on the slide. The first is to introduce our recent publication. We will dive into key trends shaping the transport sector and explore draft visions to inspire fresh thinking on future transport systems. And following this, we can look forward to introduction of the playbook of methods that you could use to develop your future-ready strategies as well as project investment pipeline. And the second part, we will showcase futures narratives. And this is about an exploratory journey taken by 3 young futurists who were invited to take meeting the equivalent after stay with us at the very end and join this opportunity sector advisory service cluster from our Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at ADB. He oversees ADB-wide collaboration on innovation, knowledge management of the transport, energy, urban, water, education, health, and finance sector.
This virtual event. Today, we are showcasing a path-breaking initiative, most important publication, Reimagining the Futures of Transport in Asia and the Pacific. Our world is increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Shocks and disruption have been more frequent. Our clients' challenges and demands are evolving rapidly in this context. We are facing unprecedented challenges, from restarting the economy to public health, food security, and of course, climate change. As a development bank, we need to be cognizant of emerging trends and understand how these will impact existing and future infrastructure systems. As a policy and decision makers in infrastructure investment, you know that the solutions of yesterday are no longer adequate to solve tomorrow's problems. It is in this context that we in ADB initiate this first deep dive into futures thinking and foresight for transport sector, delving into the complex system, trends, and implications that make it international development such a formidable challenge. We enjoyed a strong partnership with the global consulting firm, Arup, to deliver this important study, where we combine ADB's development experience in Asia Pacific with Arup's foresight expertise to deliver this important study. We are very proud to present the fruit of our collaboration today. The team was able to dig deep into material, came up with a solid foundation for visioning, strategic decision making, portfolio development, and stress testing. The knowledge products which will be presented today are meant to help you and your organization spark a different kind of conversation about possible futures, make sense of the insight, identify uncertainty, and develop strategy that are more resilient and future ready. Today, you will hear about emerging trends such as advanced technology, energy transformation, circular economy, etc. The importance of contextualization to local context, the need for a participatory approach, bringing experts and stakeholders together to co-create shared vision, and ways to walk backwards from the future to your present-day decision, charting tangible ways to achieve the shared vision. The desired outcome is simple: to create future-ready transport systems built to withstand shocks, demonstrate resilience in the face of disruption, and are flexible enough to adapt change, be it technological, societal, environmental, or economic. What could be more exciting than this? Routinely applying future thinking and foresight will be a huge paradigm shift away from the business as usual, moving away from siloed sector planning towards collaborative and participatory approaches that can catalyze transformational change. On this note, I thank you all in taking time to join us from across the globe. Let us begin our journey with reimagining the future of transport. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Song So, for sharing your opening insights and really great points raised on the challenging and yet exciting times of change that we're in. So we'll now turn to the introduction of the publication. Next slide, please. Next slide, sorry. While that is loading, so that this part will be delivered by myself and my co-presenters, Arndt Hussar and Joseph Hargrave. So may I request Arndt and Joseph to switch on their cameras? Thank you. And Arndt is my co-lead on this study. He takes care of digital transformation agenda in ADB's activities with developing member countries, be it startup ecosystems, satellite connectivity, or digitalization strategies. And at the same time, he's also really our in-house foresight specialist for many of ADB's initiatives. And Joseph is the director and global foresight leader from Arup. He focuses on trends shaping the future of built environment and their impact on strategy, innovation, and policy making. So today I'll provide a background and context on why we initiated this study. And Joseph will be sharing more about the trends and visions that we developed. And finally, Arndt will present the bespoke methodology that we have structured to support your project teams in making use of our assets to reimagine and design future transport systems. So next slide, please. So I'd like to start by sharing two main reasons why we embarked on this study. As Song Sok had touched upon earlier, the VUCA context, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And we're also living in times of very rapid urbanization and advancement in technology. And as we saw, COVID-19 has drastically changed how we live, work, and travel in cities, both in Asia as well as globally. So we were really keen to embark on this foresight study to better understand this shifting context and how it is affecting transport behaviors, which affect travel demand, patterns, and so on. And the next slide. Thank you. Another reason why we need to relook at the way we design infrastructure projects is because in the transport sector, as many of you are aware, the projects can have very long life cycles. As we know from project idea to funding approval, it could take 3 to 5 years and another 5 years for construction. And usually the infrastructure is designed to perform its role for another 50 or even 100 years to come, right? So at the same time, the future context is rapidly evolving. How big a role does 3D printing and big data play in the future of construction and operations? And what about artificial intelligence and autonomous systems and Internet of Things? So as we all look forward to rebuild a green post-pandemic recovery, we have the opportunity to look beyond the obvious because, as Song Sok mentioned, the past is no longer a good predictor of the future. And what should we know? What do we need to know to make better decisions today for tomorrow? So the study began in 2020, which was when, as you recall, the pandemic had just been declared. And looking back, we actually took a bit of a chance because this is the first time for ADB in taking such a futures thinking deep dive into one sector. But it was in an increasingly complex landscape of project delivery to meet challenging demands that our transport sector group wanted to explore a new direction in how we think about strategy, project identification, project design, as well as implementation. Next slide, please. So with this background context in mind, here is a brief overview of the methodology of how we delivered this study. We first looked at trends. What is driving change? So our study has collated a set of 10 broad trends, and this is designed to facilitate project teams and our clients to consider the implications of these trends, how they are relevant, as well as how fast the changes are occurring in their own context. And to support the visioning process, we have also drafted 8 broad visions covering a wide range of desirable futures, which Joseph will share more in a while. And under each vision, we defined incremental principles and strategies to cater to different levels of readiness across our developing member countries. As we know, there's no one size fits all for us, for all our developing member countries. So it needs to take, it has to be contextualized. So these assets are to help ADB and DMs in our developing member countries to identify and consider how we want and need future systems to look like and operate in the years and decades ahead. Next slide, please. The key assets of our study has been published, and from left to right, we have the main report, wherein describes the alternative approach to thinking about future strategies, project structuring, and this sets out the draft visions. And then we have the playbook and the trend cards, which are separately published, as they are also applicable not just to transport, but you could also use them for other infrastructure sectors. Next slide, please. So foresight can influence key stages in the project development cycle. The trend cards, visions, playbook that we've created can potentially offer you a great way of supporting structured policy dialogue to expand the possibilities in co-creating visions and strategies, as you can see in the blue bubbles, during the key stages of the project development cycle. And taking ADB project cycle as an example, we can apply foresight pathways when we conduct early stage country programming dialogue for our country partnership strategies. And this is really our earliest opportunity to discuss investment pipeline with client countries. And in doing so, we can look forward to creation of more future-oriented, holistic, and integrated strategies and policies to tackle long-term trends and implications. The pathways to enhance future readiness are applicable to project preparation stage. And this challenges project teams to think beyond business as usual, to explore previously unexplored factors across critical or emerging domains. So for example, transport projects cannot be expected to decarbonize on its own to achieve, for example, Paris alignment objectives. Integrated solutions are needed to be formulated to bring together transport and energy sectors, as well as systems approach in handling environmental and climate considerations. So for example, implementing nature-based solutions, removing fuel subsidies, and implementing carbon taxes, for example. And finally, foresight principles of continuously monitoring trends and looking into enhancing future readiness can also be applied throughout the project cycle. So I hope you found this overview useful, and let me hand over, dive into the trends and visions. Joseph, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam, for the great introduction, and welcome everyone. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I first of all want to thank my colleagues and collaborators from ADB for getting us so far on this journey. We have been working together for some time now, and it's really personally exciting and a proud moment for me and the team also to presenting this work to you today. And I think it's really critical to highlight that this is really the beginning of the journey and not the end, because of course we didn't produce this for ourselves, we produced it for you and for a wider audience so that we can start a dialogue around the future of transport across Asia and the Pacific, in many projects and in many investments and in many areas where we are all collectively active in. So hopefully this trilogy of assets, if you like, that we've created will be useful in that endeavor and will allow you also to think and explore the future in a more structured way. As Pam has already noted, we have the visions document, which is the main document outlining these visions for the future of transport that we want to present to you today. We also have the trend cards and the trend assets, and then we have the playbook. I'll be talking about the first two, and then Arne will be talking about the playbook specifically, which is about a set of methods that you can use. Next slide, please. So Pam has already mentioned this, but I think it's important to just stress this again, that when we make investments in transport and when we talk about transport infrastructure and the shift in mobility in general, these assets, investments, and projects that we get involved in often have very long life cycles, sometimes decades. And so we need to try to understand what this future context that we're designing for actually looks like. And we also know that our world today is shaped by a really complex set of influencing factors and trends. And this is part of the exercise of the trend cards, is to try to explore those in a structured way. And I again want to stress that foresight is not just about the future. Crucially, it's about making better decisions today. So that whether you're doing a transport investment, you're working on a policy document, you're developing a new strategy, or you're engaged in project delivery, you can take into account what the future looks like and adapt your decision-making processes accordingly so that you have more resilient and future-proof outcomes. And this is really what this study and the set of approaches that we're proposing is all about. Next slide. So the question that we then have is, what does our future look like? And the our, of course, can be you and your specific region or office, the projects you're working on, or your specific area of expertise. And the core question that we need to get to is to translate the general context of change into what it specifically means for you. Next slide, please. So again, how do we get to where we were today? And just to recap on what Pam had already said, but expanding a little bit on the flow of things. So first of all, we have the trends. So what is actually driving change in the world? Then we think about the context-specific implications while recognizing the diversity and maturity and requirements across the Asia-Pacific region. We then think about, well, if we know all of this change is happening, what future do we actually want? What is the future that we want to see and want to work towards? And this is why these visions are so important, so that we have a common direction that we can travel towards. And what principles are then associated with those visions and how we can get there. So what do we actually need to do and what steps do we need to take to enable and empower those visions and make it more likely that they become true? And then finally, what are the strategies associated with those principles on how you can actually get there in a practical way? And those are organized by baseline, progressive, and transformative. And I'll talk a little bit more about the differences between those in a minute. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the trends specifically, this is the ecosystem of change that we have explored. And of course, it doesn't describe every trend in the world that is happening right now, but it gives a pretty good and holistic overview of those things that are driving change specifically in the transport sector. So we have population patterns, things like the aging population and population growth in general, shift in behavior patterns, which we know has been so important and impactful in particular also during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have the idea of more integrated transport systems, combining different modes and also thinking about the role of transport in further urban design and development. We have the importance of infrastructure growth and renewal, crucially also, not just about new infrastructure, but reuse and renewal of existing assets. Of course, the impacts of climate change, which we are already seeing today and which are likely to increase significantly going forward. Wider environmental risks, the advanced technologies from AI and machine learning to robotics to new materials, the big role of energy and resources from electrification to challenges of energy security and supply. And then, of course, also economic and trade patterns, things like supply chains and overall economic growth patterns that we need to consider. And finally, the role of geopolitics and policies. So all of this creates quite a complex ecosystem of change. We have developed 3 trend cards for each of those themes. And it's important to note that the trend cards I'm showing you in a minute, they are not just there to be a digital asset. They can also be printed and used as a physical asset in workshops. We've really designed them to be flexible and adaptable for different contexts of decision making so that you can, for example, take those 30 trends that sit behind the individual themes and perhaps discuss which ones are most important to me, or where do our priorities sit within the context of a particular project. So they are designed to be flexible, agile, and for use in decision-making processes. So I think it's really, really important. They are also there to broaden the horizon of participants talking about this. If you are an expert in environmental risk, for example, it might be a useful tool to think further around the possible role of energy and resources, or integrated transport systems, to think a little bit more holistically and to think a bit more integrated. We also recognize that, of course, there is a massive diversity across Asia and the Pacific, yes, but there's also a range of shared priorities and shared drivers, and we hope that we have captured these in the trends as we presented them. Next slide, please. So let's just take a few examples of these trend cards and think about the possible implications of them, and just to share a little bit what's in the actual deck. So the first one I want to show you is a trend under the grouping of behavior patterns. And this idea of a shift to much more healthy and sustainable lifestyles. And the question we're raising here is, do travel users have safe and low carbon travel alternatives on your network? And the theme of healthy and sustainable, and healthy in particular, has of course been a massive topic in particular through the COVID-19 pandemic and the wider trends we've seen here. And the other thing that we know now also is that there is a massive and interesting and important link between the wider changes in transport around drive chains and modes of transport and technology and the overall design of urban transport systems in particular, and the impact this has on human health, both in terms of how people move, but also things like air quality and the overall quality of the environment that people live in. Next slide, please. We also know that trends around population growth and transport behavior, for example, also are closely linked to health and well-being. And as a consequence, we increasingly need to design with holistic health in mind. And I think this terminology of holistic health is really interesting. It's about the health of the people, the planet, the wider environment, and also the economy. So we have to think in a much more systemic and integrated way going forward, so that we can really achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve. And I think this is one of the things we're really trying to communicate through this study, is that thinking about outcomes beyond economic returns, for example, but also social, environmental, and economic outcomes is really, really critical for future transport system investments. We need to move away from designing in isolation and move much more for integration, also when it comes to health and well-being. Next slide. The next trend card I just want to highlight is this idea of adaptation and repurpose, and the question of how resilient is your infrastructure to future change. And of course, future change can mean many different things. It can mean changes in social behavior, but it can also mean changes in the wider environmental condition that we're experiencing, for example, through climate change. And there's a need here really to think about, well, what will the new normal look like? What will the future look like? And how do we need to design transport system as a result of that? And one of those ideas, for example, is also to say, okay, how can we adapt and repurpose existing systems? And for example, limit as a consequence the embedded carbon in these infrastructure assets instead of doing a full reconstruction. So retrofitting and repurposing as a massive theme. Next slide, please. We also know, as indicated by the graphic here, that investment continues to lag behind what is actually needed in the various regions to enhance and improve the overall infrastructure needs. So in the context of this, we just also need to find better ways to make use of existing infrastructure and to repurpose what we already have to improve the operational efficiency of things, and to focus much more on operational outcomes of existing infrastructure rather than purely new investments. So in the context of climate change as well, long-term adaptation and viability is crucial. So not just about understanding what is required today, but again, what is required in the future, adapting to climate change, being ready for this new normal, and as a consequence, renewing, repurposing, and building assets accordingly. Next slide. I think this is a topic that will increase in awareness and visibility massively over the coming years. Biodiversity loss is accelerating significantly across the world. This has potential adverse implications on all kinds of things, from the health of our economies to our ability to produce new healthcare offerings, as a lot of solutions for medicines, for example, come from ecological systems and diverse species. And of course, also wider risk to humans, for example, increased pandemic risk as we further degrade ecosystems. So reversing biodiversity loss, stopping biodiversity loss, and finding ways to counteract this is a massive theme for everyone working in the built environment over the coming decades. And transport plays a critical role in this. Next slide, please. So I see nature, and we see nature and biodiversity as one of the next big themes for all of us. it is closely related to what we need to achieve around decarbonization also. So measures to combat climate change can also be measures to combat biodiversity loss. And I think the crucial thing to say here is that large transport investments or transport investments and policy and strategy in general really has an opportunity to be net positive when it comes to biodiversity. So how can we create transport assets and how can we make transport-based design decisions that actually enhance the natural environment and not damage it? And I think this shift towards restorative and regenerative design will increasingly be on the agenda of many countries, many stakeholders, and many people working in the built environment. And this trend is an early indication of that's already happening now. Next slide. The next topic I just want to highlight is energy system transformation. This is a big topic for everyone across the globe at the moment, both in terms of the need to decarbonize energy system, but also to increase security of supply. Next slide. And one of the things we know is that there is, in general, an urgent need to achieve a rapid shift and a significant transformation of our energy system. Again, both in terms of decarbonization and security of supply, but also in terms of the type of sources we're using, the wider infrastructure for electrification and other things. Many critical metals and components that are required for this energy system transformation are currently in short supply or are from countries where future supply security is perhaps less reliable. So we need to also find new ways to achieve the energy system transformation with new innovations, for example, in metals and material use, new forms of drivetrains, and also perhaps utilization of emerging technologies such as hydrogen as alternative fuels. We also know that in many regions now there's a strong debate around the future of the combustion engine. European Union has at the moment already agreed to phase out of new vehicles with combustion engines by 2035. So there's a big shift happening in this market. And the final trend, and is future growth sectors. And this is a bit more of an uncertain one, but it's an interesting opportunity, I think, for many, many countries to think about what the future growth sectors in transport really look like and what that means for the emerging ecosystem of companies, businesses, and entrepreneurship within one's own national boundaries. Next slide, please. And I think we truly believe that there's a continued opportunity and a growing opportunity to utilize future growth sectors in transport in particular, and this idea of emerging technologies and startup ecosystems as a driver for innovation and entrepreneurship within the economies of Asia and the Pacific. And I think that all member states of the ADB and all stakeholders of the ADB should really recognize and also push for these opportunities for so-called technology leapfrogging, where we kind of bypass one development stage to really bring more innovative and forward-looking technologies and solutions to the fore sooner rather than later, and avoid a repeat of the poor decisions around some technology adoption done by others in the past. Critical to this one as well in terms of future growth sectors is really knowledge and opportunity transfer, and of course capability building, which is something that we're talking about quite extensively in our visions. Next slide, Arndt. So then let's get to the visions. So we spoke about the trends and the implications of those. And again, the trend cards are very much designed for you to explore, for you to get a sense of, decide which ones have a higher priority for you, and then also to decide how to contextualize them for your own purpose. And Arndt will be talking about some of the methodologies for that. But let's get to the visions, which are really about what future do we want and how can we get there. So as you will have seen in the opening video that we've created, we have 8 overarching visions, and of course, they are all connected and build upon each other. The first one is the idea of safe, reliable, and efficient systems. The second one talks about inclusive and accessible spaces and services. The third one about delivering resilient transport infrastructure systems. Then we have seamless transport and logistics systems as Vision 4. Delivering environmentally considerate outcomes as Vision 5, having robust institutional, financial, and technical capacity as Vision 6, technology-enabled transport services as Vision 7, and the last one, strong regional cooperation and comprehensive development. Next slide, Ant. So how are these visions structured, and what does it mean to be transformative, progressive, or baseline? Well, we had to ensure that these visions really find an audience and find relevance in a very diverse set of countries and regions when it comes to overall maturity, development priorities, and so forth. So rather than having one single vision for each of those places, we decided to switch it into principles, and within those principles to have a baseline target, a progressive target, and then a transformative target. So that depending on your development status and your priorities within that specific principles, you would have something that would be relevant for you independent of your current maturity. So if you already feel that you are progressive right now, perhaps the transformative target is right for you. If you're just starting off within a domain and something is very, very new, the first step will be to focus on the baseline. So with this, we try to create a very flexible and adaptable and agile tool that hopefully is relevant for broad audience operating and working within the transport sector. Next slide. So let's deep dive into two of the visions just to explain a little bit more how they're structured and what it actually means in practice. I'm not going to go through all of the detail of the text here because I think it's much more helpful to read this by yourself, but let's look at some of them and you'll get a sense of how they work. So this is Vision 5, delivering environmentally considerate outcomes, and it talks about future transport infrastructure and systems that will deliver environmentally considerate outcomes that go beyond mitigation to enable transport to support restorative and regenerative ecosystems. So this is also related to some of the trends, of course, that I spoke about just a minute ago. Next slide. So here you see the overview of the vision statement, and a supporting diagram to visualize a little bit what our future might look like and what the various components might be, from white roofs to self-sustaining communities, low carbon last mile mobility, ultra low emission zones. There is monitors to look after ecological health, wildlife corridors and regenerative greenways, and many other components. And we talk about 2050 being a transport system that's run on clean and renewable energy, considering circularity and resource consciousness in everything that we design, and delivering positive ecological outcomes. Next slide. So here's then an overview of the principles and strategies. You've got on the far left the various principles. So in this case, we have 4 principles: accelerate low carbon development, invest in natural capital and maximize ecological gain, minimize resource consumption and plan for circularity, and finally, design to minimize urban heat island effect and increase natural solutions. And then in the rows, we go from left to right, from baseline on the left to progressive in the middle to transformative on the right. So taking one example, for principle 2, for example, investing in natural capital and maximizing ecological gain. The baseline is mitigation of ecological impacts. The progressive is no net loss of natural capital, and the transformative is about net gain in natural capital. So putting something in place where there's actually a net positive impact on, for example, biodiversity or ecosystem health. So read them in detail, get familiar with them, and then get a sense of which of these might apply to you, baseline, progressive, and transformative, and what you can then actually do to get there. And again, there's various tools in the playbook to help you with that. Next slide. The second vision I just want to focus on is Vision 6. And we've picked this because it shows also the interrelationship between the different visions. This one is about robust institutional, financial, and technical capacity. And I think this is an absolute requirement for all of the other visions to actually work. And so this is one of the enablers, if you like, of other visions actually coming into fruition. It's about future transport being underpinned by stakeholders, champions, and leaders that are able to plan, deliver, monitor, and manage transport in the long term. And they will have the required governance, technical capacity, ability to collaborate, and innovative funding and financing partnerships, as well as supporting legislative, regulatory, and enforcement frameworks to really bring these visions and bring transport infrastructure investments forward. Next slide. Again, our overview of the vision. In this case, in 2050, the region's labor force is fully trained, skilled and knowledgeable in the latest construction, implementation, operation and maintenance practices. Leadership, financing and institutional experts support the ongoing delivery of transport services. So institutional capacity really, again, as an enabler of change and a big requirement in making all of this happen. We're talking about, again, various aspects between public-private partnerships, public tendering, upskilling in sustainable practices, but also perhaps, the capacity and the ability to do projects and processes like this, thinking about the future in a more holistic way, integrating trends and bringing foresight into future infrastructure projects. Next slide. The overview of the principles and strategies again here. We've got, first of all, principle 1, strengthening governance and building fiscal capacity. Principle 2, building technical capacity and expertise in delivering sustainable projects. Number 3, delivering through innovative partnerships and new and expanded funding. And principle 4, strengthen legislative, regulatory and enforcement capacity. Again, going from left to right, baseline, progressive and transformative. Looking again at principle 2, the first baseline is just to share best practices, having a better way to engage across regions and across departments and interregionally as well on, what does best practice look like? What are the technical requirements? And how can we share best practice and case studies for implementation elsewhere? The progressive is providing training incentives for upskilling and to enable willing personnel to have more knowledge and deeper knowledge around the requirements of much more sustainable transport, for example. And then the transformative is really about radical upskilling, where we broaden and diversify both the sources of this training and also the focus of it to enable a much more trained, aware, and high capacity workforce when it comes to future transport investments. Next slide, please. So again, this was a quick overview of some of the visions. Please take the time to read them. Please take the time to contextualize which ones might be relevant for you. And we hope we've really struck a good balance here to cover a wide range of things that we think will really be driving and enabling change in the transport sector over the coming decades. Next slide. And finally, we want to get to a more preferable future. We want to get to a future where these visions become true. And it's not about kind of setting an ambitious target and then not being able to get there. It's about making tangible steps towards a better future. And just a reminder that foresight, again, is not about the future, just about the future. It's crucially about making better decisions today. And the decisions you make today will shape our common future. So it's important to take note of that. And with that, I will hand over to Arndt to talk to you about the playbook and the general materials.
Yeah, thank you. And that was quite a journey through all the material that was produced in the course of these 2 years of collaborating. Thank you very much, Joseph, for highlighting all these different components. We've now come to the part that's all covered in the report. And Joseph also highlighted some of our trend card material. So all these trends that you see covered in the report were then packaged in this little deck of cards. I just want to re-emphasize it. It's also downloadable from the link that you would hopefully find in your chat box. Now, my role is to introduce another piece of this project, and that's the playbook. It's a little bit like a toolbox, but we felt like that sounded too much like a tool, and we wanted to emphasize that really this material is for you to play with, to explore and to use it for contextualization. So when you now take this playbook, what it will do for you is it will provide you with a number of pathways into this material and the relevant proformas, or we can call them worksheets, that you can use either doing this on your own, but even better doing it with a group of people, internally, externally, in a participatory manner, ideally. So you really get the value of these methodologies. They're meant to be engaging and bringing out ideas that you may not otherwise bring out. It's combining the trend cards, the report with this playbook, where you get the most value and where we feel we can now build on our products and go more into context. So let me run you through this playbook and highlight a few opportunities. First of all, we are offering in the playbook 4 different pathways or user journeys of how you can engage with the material. The first one being to map trends, the second one, enhancing the future readiness, the third, developing strategy, and the fourth, creating visions. I'll give you an example for each of these, but there are many more worksheets and performas in the playbook, which we hope you will explore. So let's go to the first one, mapping trends. And this is exactly modeling what we did in our project, which was to explore the landscape of trends that are shaping the future, to really analyze which trends are relevant to you and your work, and then to capture the possible implications for a project, a region, or a sector theme. And then to develop a more holistic understanding of the future trends that matter to you. There are several worksheets that we are providing in the playbook for you to explore. One of them is this one, and that is about ranking the impact and uncertainty of various trends. Because it is fine and well to do the big map, what you really want to explore with foresight is those things that are very impactful, but also very uncertain. We call these the critical uncertainties, because those are the areas where you're really not so sure what the future will be, but you understand that this would have tremendous impact on your decisions today. So this tool will allow you to sort your trends in this matrix, and it also serves as a starting point for other methods, such as, for example, scenario planning, which you may have heard about in the past. The second pathway is about generating ideas and getting future ready. This is about really developing or refining project concepts, notes, through a conscious consideration of emerging trends, opportunities, and challenges. And there you can identify opportunities for more thematic integration, for example, across different stakeholders, across different sectors. A whole host of methodologies that we propose, and it combines, again, trend analysis with some deeper work on generating ideas. The methodology that I want to highlight to you here is this idea generation matrix, where you take the trends and you look at the specific opportunities that relate to your project and the challenges for your project for each of the trends. A very simple matrix, but if you work through this with Post-its and you have a group of people contributing, you often identify some very interesting opportunities and challenges. The third pathway is to develop a strategy. And here you can see there are many more worksheets listed here on the right side. And we actually say that you can stretch this as long as 6 days of workshopping, but you could also do a one-day workshop. So the timing of how much time you may want to invest into these processes is also given in the playbook. Now, this is not hard and fast rules. It's just ideas for you to kind of orient yourself. And in the case of the strategy development, we are really looking at developing some plausible and consistent pathways toward the future, and to develop a set of scenarios that represent different future states. This is a very popular method and a very well-tested one, and really does expand your horizon if you deploy it. And let me give you an example of a worksheet that we have provided here, and that's this one of identifying trends and emerging issues. So this is called a 2x2 matrix, where you do look at the various critical uncertainties that you have identified, and you juxtapose them and basically map out that space, which is all critical and uncertain to you. And then you figure out what the extreme developments of these uncertainties could be. For example, digital literacy is amazingly developed, or there's very low digital literacy. If you have identified that as your uncertainty, you're able to now navigate the space and really identify what the trends and emerging issues are in that space. You could also deploy a different worksheet, and that is stress testing. And I personally love this very much because oftentimes we already have a strategy sitting on our shelf, and we really just want a quick and dirty run through that strategy and stress test it. Now, if you have scenarios developed, then you can insert the various elements of your strategy into the different scenarios, and you can stress test it very quickly, trying to get an understanding of how your strategy would perform against the conditions of a given scenario. So you immerse your existing strategy or the strategy that you have drafted into these future possible realities, and you gain insights and can derive from that a stronger, more resilient strategy. Let me go to pathway D, and that's the last one in the playbook. It's about visioning. Now, this is not necessarily the last in sequence, but it is a different way of engaging the material. And that is when you really want to bring various stakeholders on board, where you want to find more cohesion in how a group or an organization or partners look at the future and what you agree on as a desirable future. And so here it's important to start with the trends and to bring everybody on board, but then to really navigate through the full set of worksheets and methods that we have provided, looking at what are the things that you find are desirable in the future. You could do scenario planning for that, but you could also do other visioning exercises. And there is, again, a host of materials available to you for you to deploy. Two worksheets I want to highlight. The first one is one that is actually related to the trend mapping. So let's say you have identified a specific trend. The futures wheel is a very well tested and often deployed methodology where you simply expand from the trend here noted in the middle outward, and you look at the first order effects and implications that this trend may carry with it. And then you go out to the next row, or the next circle, which then has the second order effects and consequences, and so on and so forth. And then you try to map out the relationships between these. And you really gain a better understanding of your possible future reality surrounding a given trend. A second worksheet I want to highlight when it comes to visioning is this one, and that is backcasting. When you do have a vision developed, it is very useful to work backwards from that vision. And at times we actually struggle very much with the current day situation, with disagreements about what the future may look like, but we find it easier to agree on a desirable future. And then once we have agreed on that, it feels easier to people to work backwards and to discover what are the different milestones that need to be met and achieved on the path towards that desirable future. So backcasting, again, a very popular method, and I would highly recommend it if you do have a strategy to work this way, work your way backwards to the present, to identify what are those bottlenecks, what are the key decisions that you need to take, what are the resources that you need to put behind those different possible pathways towards the future. Now, I'm wrapping up the presentation section of our different knowledge products, and I encourage you to download these materials, which are again listed here on this slide, to contact us if you have requests touch about a project that you're involved in. And we do have more coming up in this webinar. The next session will be quite exciting, so please stay with us. But at this point, I'd like to hand over to the Chief of the Transport Sector Group in ADB, Jamie Leather, to give some closing remarks to our first session. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you very much, Arndt, and thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks for the excellent overview of this incredible bit of work. I just wanted to say something that I'm picking up on what Arndt just mentioned in terms of backcasting. The reason I think this is excellent work, it is also incredibly valuable. Sharad Saxena, a colleague of ours at the ADB, we worked together on backcasting for Delhi way back in 2008, I think, just to try and reimagine, as the title says, reimagine a different future for the transport system in Delhi. The reason I wanted to raise that is because subsequently, when was that, 2008, so some 14 years ago, subsequently, we have provided a number of assistance to the government of India and the Delhi capital region, commuter rail systems, as well as public transport improvements and non-motorized transport and access egress arrangements around some of those major transports. So it was that different forecasting, backcasting type of approach that really allowed us to discuss with our clients how we could think of a different future, a better future, rather than where we are today and incrementally adding on that and seeing what it means. At a certain point, we need a sort of shift in how we think about infrastructure or how we think about transport. And that is based around what the future and what the future components we need to think about. We need to understand where that future demand will come from, what that demand might look like. We need to factor in other components, sustainable development goals, Paris Agreement on climate change, and from an ADB perspective, our strategy 2030 and what our corporate objectives are. So those are the basic building blocks of what we would like the future contain and what we should be focusing on, and building that through into the type of work and the futures that we are looking to develop. The other point I wanted to raise, while this is transport, we can't do it alone. And I think another advantage of this future thinking is to look at what are not just the building blocks from a transport perspective, but the building blocks from a whole range of other components as well. And if I just raise one example in climate change, we can't certainly do this alone in transport. If we do try to decarbonize or shift to other powertrains, be they electric vehicles, then clearly we would have to work very closely with our colleagues in energy sector for power generation requirements or battery storage. We'd also have to work with industries in terms of where are those vehicles coming from, and environment in terms of cleaning up of batteries in the future as well. So the future must be considered differently. It must be considered in a more cross-cutting way. And with that, we should be working with a whole host of other sectors, not just looking at it from a narrow transport perspective. We must also look at some of these mega trends. I already mentioned SDGs and climate change, but other components that may allow us to do things quite differently in the future. And here I'm thinking of innovation and technologies and digitalization. These can unlock a very different future from our current or historical way of doing stuff. So we shouldn't be constrained by what is there today. The whole purpose here is really to look at a bright, brave new future and understand what those actions are. So I hope, final words in terms of this, it's opening up a whole new set of opportunities. It doesn't mean we're stopping delivering what we're doing or what we do best, but this is an opportunity for us to tailor our infrastructure systems and our transport support to meet the multifaceted challenges for tomorrow and ensure those are embedded in the discussions and in the actions we're taking today. So thank you all very much for that. And with that, I'll draw this session to a close and hand it back to you, I believe, Arndt. Thank you very much. Looking forward to this next section.
Thank you, Jamie. And really, it was a pleasure working with you and your team on this study.